Let's speak now to the defense and security analyst, Kabiru Adamu. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Look back for us at the last decade of terror in Nigeria since the killing by the military or the police, or one of them, of the charismatic founder of Boko Haram, Mohammed Yusuf.
10 years down the road, a figure of between 30,000 to 100,000, depending on what statistics you decide.
That is an enormous number of people.
Exactly. And I mean, the latest of such horrific killings was on Saturday when mourners coming back from a funeral ceremony were gunned down in what appeared to be a reprisal attack. 65 of them were confirmed dead, and the numbers could even be higher than that. So it's been a decade of horrific killings. Over 2 million displaced persons, some would go with 3 million plus. Refugees, Nigerians in Cameroon, in Chad, and like you mentioned in your opening remarks, from one group, we are dealing with probably about three distinct groups now, all of them more or less fractured. And unfortunately, the underlying reasons that gave rise to the insurgency are still there as they were 10 years ago. Lack of respect for constitutional authority, even the killing of the leader of the group, Mohammed Yusuf. He was arrested by the military, handed over to the police, and then they extrajudicially killed him. It was caught on video and has been featured. We are not aware, and it has never been mentioned by the authorities, that those that did the killing have been subjected to the laws of the land in any way. So the same underlying reasons that led to the rise of the insurgency are still existing as they were 10 years ago. The government has attempted through several approaches. The most prominent one is the counter-insurgency approach, which has a heavy military component. Documents have been initiated to introduce the soft approach to countering terrorism, but I think they are still at the level of document, even though I think early this year, if I'm right, a commission was constituted by the Nigerian government, the Northeast Development Commission, which has the objective of addressing some of the root causes of this insurgency. So there is some hope, as it were, in the future. If that commission would key into the civil countering violent extremism component of the counter-terrorism approach, then the root causes of the insurgency are likely to be at least affected. Of course, one of the prominent issues that the Nigerian government, the Buhari administration, has always talked about is the Lake Chad Basin, and how they are going to, counter the climatic changes that are affecting the Lake Chad Basin.
And that would make a difference.
Exactly, because the economic livelihood of the people. I'm trying to talk about the root causes of the insurgency and how the economic livelihood of the people of that region has been affected by the receding Lake Chad Basin. The Nigerian government has attempted severally to bring in international partners to see how that lake can be.
But that still hasn't got off the ground.
No, it hasn't.
Right. And the point, of course, is that many people, experts like yourself, have said that you can't defeat the insurgency militarily, that there has to be something more. Part of it, this economic thing that you're talking about, the other part, a negotiated settlement. I mean, there have been discussions in the suggestions in the past. At one stage, I think just not too long ago, there was talk that the government was engaging them in negotiations. Is it being made more difficult because you've got these splinter groups now, that sort of negotiation?
Definitely. On the one hand, you have the group itself subsisting more or less
of Boko Haram.
Exactly, essentially. It has carved out a niche, and as far as we know, that niche has not been in any way disrupted by the counter-insurgency operations ongoing by the Nigerian government. So the leadership of the group has been thriving for the past 10 years. There are 2 or 3 basic individuals that more or less have remained prominent since the beginning of the insurgency more than 10 years ago. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have what some people would call the political economy of the funding of the insurgency that appears to have a head of its own, and that means, for instance, that stakeholders, government, military, and a few others, even international development partners, are probably benefiting from the insurgency. So that type of accusation is ongoing, and perhaps that's what makes the negotiation quite difficult.
Sure.
Because if they are benefiting, quote unquote, from the funding of the insurgency, then there is no incentive really to bring the insurgency to an
and
end.
just looking back to the root of all of this, Mohammed Yusuf, that was the central figure. I mean, he founded Boko Haram, I understand, around 2002 in Maiduguri, and that has been the epicenter of the insurgency ever since. But apart from giving the impression that he hated the West, including, of course, Western education, he had some very unorthodox beliefs, didn't he? I mean, I was listening to an interview that he gave in which he questioned the belief that the world is round, suggesting that because it is a hypothesis that he claimed contradicted the Quran, it was therefore null and void. He also questioned the theory of Darwinism and evolution, theories which he said were heretical.
So that's Mohammed Yusuf. His belief and his ideological underpinnings were derived from the Quran, as it were, and anything contrary to that belief, of course, he was not shy in saying it. That is his perception of the teachings of the Quran. Now, I know that Islamic clerics, have picked holes on that perception and have attempted to engage him in debates, and most times he has failed in convincing them, which is even what led to his so-called migration, because remember, that's how the insurgency began.
Yes.
He migrated, quote unquote, because he felt he did not have the support of the clerics, the Islamic clerics that he did. And the reasons were clear. His attempt to convince them using knowledge from the Quran was not successful. And instead of him to, quote unquote, give up on the belief, he migrated and then unfortunately got the kind of numbers he got.
Right. And of course, it all came to a head in July 2009. I understand that Boko Haram staged a failed uprising against the Nigerian government in which 800 people died and many Boko Haram members were arrested. Just pick up that story for us from there.
There was an attempt. So there are some questions here and there, but we know that there was, I think, a funeral. And then there were some state security agents arrested some members of the group, and then they raided where they were being held, the detention. And then the then government the Nigerian government ordered a raid on the headquarters of the group. And now it is the result of that raid that led to the number of deaths that you mentioned.
Yes,
there.
because I remember seeing this absolutely horrendous video where in the middle of a market square or in the middle of the city center, in the presence, the full view of everybody, the police and soldiers were simply marching a group of people sitting down, simply marching them to a particular spot, lying them down and shooting them.
Now,
in the presence of everybody.
There were reports like that, which have not been verified, even though you've got international organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to have attempted to document that, and have even accused the Nigerian military of heavy-handedness in their approach to that. But on both sides, you had a period of about 2 years where the group Jamaat al-Ahlussunnah al-Dawlat wal-Jihad continued in a strategic manner to execute all those who supported the government attempt to clamp down on the group. So
they were always an armed organization, were they?
Well, I think it would be unfair to categorize them as such, even though they were preaching this kind of revolutionary suggestions, but they were not armed, quote unquote, at least not outwardly. The period of change was post-2009, after the raid on their headquarters and the horrific killing of their leader. I think that is what changed the whole game. The video that showed their leader being executed summarily. It was shown on Al Jazeera and several other media houses. And for them, the ones that escaped that horrific, clampdown, joined forces with Al Qaeda in the Sahel.
And of course, at that point, the government, the Nigerian government, thought they'd crushed the group.
Exactly.
Is that why they just sort of relaxed and let them
I wouldn't say they relaxed. I wouldn't say they relaxed.
Right.
Perhaps, yes, there was an impression that by taking out the head, the group has been quelled.
But of course, another head popped up.
Exactly.
Shekau.
Exactly, and who was even more ferocious, more deadly in his tactics. And then I think he also came back with that anger that you've killed my members, my fellow brothers and sisters. You've also killed my leader in such a dastardly manner. So that anger also drove the kind of horrific killings that we saw, because one of the ideological underpinnings of, or rather his strategy, is to strap young girls and send them into huge gatherings, markets, transportation hubs, and then the bomb goes off. And I think that is what sort of gave his group the biggest challenge it has in terms of its ideological following. The other quote-unquote jihadist groups questioned the fact that why would you send young girls strapped with bombs in places where there are Muslims and Christians and everyone. And then, of course, he didn't make a distinction between religious places of worship and non-religious places of worship. So that, of course, led to the fractionalization of the group and the emergence of the Islamic State in West Africa province.
That's absolutely fascinating. Please stay with us. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we mark 10 years since the killing of the leader of Boko Haram and the beginning of the group's violent insurgency. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyekodu. Now, 10 years ago today, the leader of Boko Haram, Nigeria's militant Islamist group, was killed in police custody. His death sparked a campaign of terror by his followers across northern Nigeria that's left, by some estimates, more than 30,000 people dead and more than 2 million people displaced. Between just 2013 and 2015, Boko Haram are reported to have killed more than 11,000 people. And in one attack alone in the town of Baga, 2,000 people were reportedly killed. They also seized lots of territory in the northeast and even parts of neighboring Niger, Chad and Cameroon. So can the militant group remain a force in Nigeria and the region into the next decade? Well, with me in the studio, the defense and security analyst Kabiru Adamu. Thank you for staying with us. And of course, as we heard there, between 2013 and 2015, obviously the deadly conflict was now well into its most violent stages, as it were. Boko Haram were reported to have killed more than 11,000 people. As I said, 2,000 in Baga alone, seizing territory all over the place. But the Nigerian army managed to claw back a lot of that territory.
A lot, yeah. I mean, the past government under President Goodluck Jonathan did a lot of effort in that just before the elections in 2015. I think a 2-month period where...
That was an ostensible reason why the election was postponed.
Was postponed, exactly.
Right.
And then they brought in mercenaries, I think, from South Africa. And then that period was really, really good for the Nigerian military. They were able to recapture most of the territory that was under the control of the group, Jamaat al-Dawat wal-Jihad. When President Buhari came into power in 2015, when he was elected and sworn in May, he also continued with that faith, and we saw all the territories that was under the control of the group, Boko Haram, come back to government control.
Right.
Currently, the circumstances are a bit unclear. You have about 4 or 5 local governments in northern Borno where there seems to be no...
It's sort of no man's land.
No man's land. All the forward operating bases of the Nigerian military have been destroyed. The military has redeployed from those locations. You have some form of civilian presence, but then you also see symbols indicating that the group, ISWAP, Islamic State in West Africa province, is quite active in those regions. But the good news is that it does not have any administrative control over those locations. So it's neither here nor there. If they decide, for instance, as a strategy to take up control of this land, I think it's very possible that they will do that.
Right, but let me ask you this. In those areas, you mentioned 4 or 5 local governments, and that sort of fairly wild area around Lake Chad and so on. That is where you've also got the other Boko Haram factions. I mean, I'm wondering whether there's any level of cooperation between them, or whether they've got to the point where they don't cooperate with each other at all, and therefore potentially could be fighting turf wars as well amongst themselves.
So the geographical distribution and dominance of the two groups is fairly, well marked. If I use that, even though the Nigerian military, after having pursued some major operations and successes, have dislodged or dislocated this geographical dominance, and we've seen instances where the two factions may have, operated in the same territory and more or less fought each other.
Right.
A good example I'll give you is the killing of Maman Nur sometime last year, one of the major commanders of the group. It's unclear why he was killed, but we know it was an internal fight.
Yes, I think I heard about something to that effect.
Between the group. So even though there are marked territories, quote and unquote, belonging to ISWAP, and the other marked territory belonging to Jamaat al-Alisina al-Dawat wal-Jihad, which is more closer to central Borno, around the Sambisa forest and Alagano forest, and then you have ISWAP more in the Lake Chad area of Borno, but perhaps because of this ongoing military operation, they've been dislocated. It's also very important to note the significance of the multinational joint task force involving Chad, Niger, Benin Republic, and to an extent Cameroon, that has limited the ability of especially the Islamic
So kind of
State.
limited them to a particular area.
Exactly.
Right. Well, you would have thought that would make it easier to destroy them.
Well,
because I mean, they're sort of surrounded.
But you have to remember that the Lake Chad Basin is such a vast territory with different islands,
Right.
and then we have to admit the relative weak capacity of the militaries in those regions.
Right.
Nigeria needs credit needs to be given to the Nigerian government. It's more or less carrying and sponsoring the multinational joint task force under the auspices of the Lake Chad Basin Commission. If you compare that with the G5, that the Western world, in particular France, seems to have championed, and it's putting forward. They are getting funding, but the multinational joint task force is really relegated to the background. So
Right.
Nigeria has had to carry that burden.
And in terms of strategy, because obviously there's the military bit. I mean, ISWAP seems to be more confrontational. They'll go to military barracks and so on. You mentioned the other lot, the Boko Haram rump of it, tends to do more sort of asymmetric attacks. But one thing that they all appear to have in common is the kidnapping of people. Because, of course, it was Boko Haram that kidnapped the Chibok girls. That brought them international fame in 2014. Lots of global outrage. The Bring Back Our Girls campaign, all of that became a movement. Michelle Obama was part of it. But 5 years later, many of the students still missing, and many more kidnapped.
Exactly. I mean, frankly, nobody has, I would say, the correct figure of number of persons kidnapped by this group. We have to separate the types of kidnapping. There is the more strategic type of kidnapping, like happened in Chibok and Dapchi.
Right.
And then you have the more random types where it's never even documented or reported. I mean, then we have to remember instances where they go to boarding schools belonging to boys, slaughter, kill, and then kidnap the ones that they are alive, and sometimes you also have to include the forced conscription, which to an extent is an element of that kidnapping. They kidnap, they conscript forcefully, and then indoctrinate during the process. So you have all of that unfortunately has never been documented and perhaps will never be. It's a good thing that the Chibok incidents received the kind of attention it did, because it has helped in documenting that this is happening. And then of course we also need to give credit to the Bring Back Our Girls group that has succeeded in keeping that issue in the front burner of discussion. And then more importantly, I think even the government has had to respond more proactively and perhaps even more from in terms of view with attempts to get the girls out as a result of this kind of pressure. But in terms of the kidnapping itself, I would say there are two types. The strategic types, and then the other type meant for obtaining some form of either ransom, you could call it political ransom, or financial ransom. I mean, it is documented that one of the ways that they use in generating funding for their activities is through this kidnapping activities.
And so, just as we look forward now, we were looking back at the last 10 years, looking forward into the next 10 years. The group has undergone a metamorphosis, one faction declaring allegiance to the Islamic State, replacing Shekau with a new leader, at least certainly for that branch. Clearly different, they're different from one another. I mean, they've got a different focus now. Has that split, looking forward, given a new lease of life to the insurgency? Is it likely to still be around 10 years from now? I mean, that's a hypothetical question, I understand.
Yes, but we try to address it using what we know, and then of course the unknown we leave behind. So there are developments internationally that have influenced happenings in the Sahel region, including in Nigeria. One of them is the international coalition against IS that has led to the collapse of IS, as it were, in Iraq and Syria. And then of course we've listened to statements by al-Baghdadi, the leader of IS, calling on jihadists across the world to support their brothers in West Africa. And then we have heard, and I'm sure the Nigerian intelligence wings to have also picked up on that returnee jihadists, some of them African, some of them Nigerian, have actually joined the ramp of Islam. And this happened late last year into early this year. So that increase in the size membership of ISWAP is quite significant. Let's remember that increase comes with a lot of things. Firstly, knowledge. They are bringing in, war knowledge, tactics, methods, bomb making, knowledge, and other strategy knowledge that they are, important, quote unquote, as it were, to the local wing of IS here in Nigeria. The other very important aspect is also
briefly.
The response by the Nigerian government, as it were. We've actually seen an increase in terms of the military component of the counters.
So it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Well, the other
very briefly, we're literally out of time.
The new governor in Borno State has been making some very, very important statements.
Okay.
He seemed to understand that unemployment and poverty are related to the insurgency.
On that rather depressing note, I'm going to leave it there. Kabiru Adamu, thank you very much indeed.
That's
it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow from me and the team here in Abuja. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.